Imagine you are standing on planks of oak wood that are soaked in tar, and beneath you rages the icy ocean that is just waiting to swallow you. It is dark, and the wind whistles so loudly that you cannot understand your own word while the cold pierces your skin like 1,000 tiny needles. You are on a Viking longship in the middle of the North Sea, and there is no escape. The year is 950. And you have just left the arguably most important trading metropolis of the north, which today lies on German soil, namely Haithabu in Schleswig-Holstein. But out here on the open sea, there is a deadly problem that we have to solve today. How the hell do you survive this journey without freezing to death? You look around and notice something shocking. There is no fire on board, no glowing coals, and no stove to warm you. How did these people achieve the impossible and heat their ships on the icy seas without digging their own graves in the process? Was it magic? Was it a lost technology? Or was it something much darker and more brutal that pushed the human body to its absolute limits? That is exactly what we are finding out right now. We begin our investigation not on the water but in the narrow and muddy alleys of Haithabu. This city was the gateway to the world and was strategically perfectly located between the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. When you stroll through the ramparts today, you might still feel the breath of history, but back then, this was a place full of noise, stench, and wealth. Here the ships were loaded, and here the secret of warmth was prepared. You have to understand that a Viking ship is basically an open basket. There is no lower deck where you can hide and no protected space from the elements. If it rains, you get wet, and if it snows, you get buried. So why did they not light a fire? The answer is as logical as it is deadly. An open fire on a wooden ship that is sealed with flammable tar and driven by giant sails made of wool would be pure suicide. A single spark in the stormy wind and the ship would turn into a floating torch. So they had to find another solution to heat the body without burning the surroundings. First piece of our mystery puzzle we find in the clothing of the men who went on board in Haithabu. It was no ordinary clothing. Have you ever wondered why sheep can stand in the rain without freezing? The secret is the lanolin. That is the natural wool wax that makes the fibers water repellent. The women in Haithabu did not wash the wool clean but deliberately left the fat in it. When you wear this wool, you wear an armor against the wetness. But clothing alone is not enough when the temperature drops to -20 degrees Celsius and the sea spray crashes over the side of the ship. Here comes the next clue into play, which is often overlooked. The diet. Imagine you had to eat 5,000 calories a day just to not die. The Vikings knew intuitively that the human body itself is a furnace if you give it the right fuel. They ate mass amounts of dried fish that was spread with butter or fatty meat that they carried in barrels. So they did not heat their ships from the outside but from the inside. Your stomach becomes a power plant that produces heat while it burns the fat. Is that not a brutal concept? You eat against death itself. But what happened at night? When the darkness fell and the movement stopped, the cold became a silent killer. You cannot sleep when you are shivering. And exactly here we stumble upon an invention that is as brilliant as it is simple, and which we can reconstruct through archaeological finds. They called it hudfat. Go ahead and say it out loud, hudfat. That sounds foreign, but it was their life insurance. It was a sleeping bag made of leather or fur that was large enough to hold 2 or even 3 men. Yes, you heard that right. They shared the sleeping bag. Why? Because a single body loses too much heat in sleep, but 2 bodies heat each other up. It was not a question of privacy, but a question of survival. These leather bags were often lined with fur and sewn so tightly that they were almost waterproof. They lay closely huddled together on the floor of the ship, directly on the planks under which the icy water rushed. Can you imagine the claustrophobia? Squeezed into leather and smelling of sweat, tar, and wet dog while the ocean tosses the ship back and forth? Yet there is an even darker layer to this story that we must illuminate. What happened when the storm was so strong that you could not sleep? When the water sloshed over the gunwale and you had bailed day and night to keep from sinking? In such moments, no sleeping bag helped. Here, the Vikings resorted to a psychological weapon. You could call it a kind of controlled trance. There are reports and sagas that suggest they put themselves into a state where they ignored the pain of the cold. the reality was often more cruel. Frostbite was the order of the day. When you can no longer feel your fingers and they turn black, you have a problem that no doctor on board can solve. We have to ask ourselves, how many men never returned to Haithabu or came back as cripples? The sea took its toll. Another fascinating aspect is the construction of the ship itself. Look at the wood. They used oak. Oak is hard and resilient, but it also conducts cold damn well. To compensate for this, they had mobile tent constructions on board. When the ship was at anchor or the wind was favorable, they could stretch a tent canvas over the deck. You can see this very well on the reconstructions of the Gokstad ship. Under this canvas, the body heat of the 30 or 40 men on board accumulated. It was stuffy, and the air was thick enough to cut, but it was warm. They created a microclimate of human exhalation. Does that sound disgusting to you? For these men, it was the sweet scent of life. Without these tent canvases, would have simply frozen to death on long journeys to Iceland or Greenland. But what about the hot stones? There is a theory that keeps popping up, and that we have to investigate like detectives at a crime scene. Could they heat stones? When they were on land, they naturally made fires. They cooked soup in giant cauldrons, and they heated flat stones in the bed of embers. These stones stored the heat for hours. It is highly likely that they wrapped these hot stones in thick cloths and took them on board when they set sail. So for the first hours of the journey, you had a kind of hot water bottle made of granite. But as soon as the stone was cold, it was just dead weight. On the open sea, they could not heat it again. So this method was only a short reprieve before the true cold struck. Now we have to talk about the darkest secret of the cold: paradoxical undressing. Do you know this phenomenon? When the body enters the final stage of hypothermia, something bizarre happens in the brain. The blood vessels suddenly dilate, and the warm blood shoots from the body core into the extremities. The dying person feels an agonizing heat even though they are actually freezing to death. Corpses of sailors and hikers have been found who stripped naked shortly before their death. Imagine you are on this Viking ship, and your comrade next to you suddenly starts tearing his clothes off his body and screams that he is too hot. You have to hold him down and force him to keep the wool on while he fights against you. That is the true horror of the icy sea. It is a battle against the madness that the cold triggers. Discipline on board had to be ironclad to prevent such situations. Let us look back to Haithabu. When a ship returned after months, it was no longer the same, and the crew was scarred. The city received them not only as heroes, but also as survivors. We find skeletons in the graves around the old settlements with bone changes that indicate constant exposure to cold and rheumatism. The price for the wealth they brought home through trade and raids was their own health. They sacrificed their bodies to the sea. But was it worth it? Back then, Haithabu was the center of power. Furs from the north, amber from the Baltic Sea, and slaves from the east were traded here. And all of this was only possible because these men had perfected the technique of surviving without fire. We also have to consider the navigation because time is warmth. The faster you reach your destination, the less time you spend in the cold. Their ships were masterpieces of hydrodynamics. They glided over the waves instead of fighting against them. A well-sailed longship could reach speeds of up to 15 knots. That is almost 30 kilometers per hour. In a time without motors that is like flying. This speed was their best heater because it shortened the agony. Whoever dawdled died. It was a race against the dropping body temperature. Let us summarize the evidence. How did they heat their ships? The shocking answer is, not at all. They did not heat the ship, but they minimized the heat loss. It was a combination of extremely high-fat food, water-repellent wool clothing, the ingenious system of shared leather sleeping bags, and the use of body heat under tent canvases. They accepted the suffering as part of the job. There was no comfort and no safety. What does that mean for us today? When we get into our air-conditioned cars today or turn up the heating, we have forgotten what cold really means. For the people in Haithabu and on the oceans, cold was a living monster that was always present. Their heating was the community and the physical closeness to their comrades. In our modern distanced world, that is perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from the Vikings. When the going gets tough and the storms of life are raging, nothing warms you as much as cohesion and mutual support. They survived because they were a unit. One for all and all in the same cold boat. Next time you are freezing in winter, think of the open deck of a longship in the year 950. Think of the darkness, the ice water, and the men who huddled together in leather covers just to see the next morning. That is the true story behind the glorious conquests. No fire, only blood, wool, and the iron will to survive.